Hello, friends. This is Dave Herewith, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Ask Dave. In one of our last talks, someone mentioned we were talking about composers who were polarizing. You either love them or hate them. And the asker said, well, they're kind of like Marmite. Either you love it or you hate it. That revolting yeast spread that people in the UK either love or detest, or Vegemite in Australia. It's sort of the same thing. Well, I just wanted to prove a point. I mentioned, yes, I have Marmite, and there it is, in case you were curious. It's actually a handy addition to certain things when you require umami, which is, that strange fifth taste, which really doesn't probably exist, but the Japanese think it does. And it's savoriness. And Marmite has a lot of savoriness. It sort of may be too much sometimes, but, I'm just letting you know, there it is. Anyway, this has nothing to do with today's topic, which is another Ask Dave, in which a viewer asks me, what is bad form? Bad musical form. Because I talk about people who have a dysfunctional approach to form and a terrible form. And, one of the locus classicus bad form pieces I mentioned is the Lalo Symphony Espagnole, the first movement of it. Particularly, the rest isn't so bad, because Lalo's first movements are often formally dysfunctional. And yes, that's a very interesting question. What is bad form? But I'm going to take a fairly abstract approach to answering this question, because as soon as I start talking about concrete examples, someone's going to say, oh, it's not bad form, I love it. Well, whether you love it or not, as I've said a million times here, really isn't the issue. The issue is what the thing is. And in the case of form, what it is actually not all that subjective in terms of how it actually operates. But you'll understand once I get to it. So let's begin with what is form. What is form in music? Well, form in music is very simple. At its most essential, it is the creative waste of time, because music occupies time. And form is the thing that allows the music to occupy more time. There are large forms and small forms. Some of them take very little time to complete themselves. Others stretch on indefinitely. So that's in its essence, that's what a form is. It's the thing that allows the composer to organize the music so as to occupy the temporal space that the work exists in, or in which the work exists. So I don't end the sentence with a preposition. Very, very basic idea. A lot of people don't think about form very much, and I'm a form whore, as I've said many, many, many times. I just think it's the most fascinating subject of the world, because it's like understanding how big your house is, and why its proportions are elegant and beautiful, or somehow off kilter or out of whack. So yeah, that's what form is. So, given the fact that form is the thing that allows the composer to use time, to create the temporal space in which the piece of music exists, what does form consist of? Well, that's also very, very simple. These are really, really basic concepts, and it's actually, I think, helpful to talk about them, to go to the fundaments of what we're thinking about. All form consists of two qualities, just two. Not more than that, just two. Repetition and variation. That's it. Without repetition and variation, there is no form. When we say a piece is formless, we might say, well, it seems to have no sense of shape. Why does something have no shape? It has no shape because nothing ever gets repeated. Now, the thing that gets repeated can be a melody, it can be a noise, it can be a timbre, it can be a dynamic, it can be a rhythm, it can be anything. But there has to be some form of repetition. Otherwise, you will never have any clue what you're listening to, how long it's going to last, why it's doing what it's doing, when it's going to stop, any of those things, where you are in it. one of the genius factors about sonata form, which we've talked about many, many times, is that is a kind of form that always tells you where you are in it. You know whether you're in the beginning, the middle, or the end. It's a feeling you have. And what gives you that feeling is the handling of tonality or key, the way the composer does it. And we're not going to go into that because we've talked about sonata form, and you can watch my video on what is sonata form. Please go and have a look. That'll give you a sense of it. But different forms do different things in that sense, and sonata form is one of them. Anyway, so there is repetition. Repetition is like mucho importante. Then there's variation, because if you simply repeat the same thing endlessly over and over again ad nauseum, you're going to have what we call in the business boredom, ennui, monotony. I'm not talking about pieces which or styles which are based fundamentally on a certain type of repetition. For example, early minimalism, which is incredibly repetitious. That's part of the aesthetic. It's part of what the composer's doing. And just because there's tons and tons of repetition, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with the form. Because ultimately, once you have deployed your repetitions with or without variation to prevent them from becoming excruciatingly monotonous, the artistic element of handling a form is the composer's sense of how long the thing has gone on and whether it's enough. Some composers have a superb sense of timing. They say, okay, this is as far as it can go, and we can't go further than that. Others have a dreadful sense of timing. Everything goes on too long. You might say that Wagner had a defective sense of timing because he just couldn't make himself stop. That may or may not be true, but it's a little bit different when you're working in theatrical media, because you have, in addition to the purely musical aspects of repetition and variation, a story that you're telling. And that story has its own overarching arc that has to come to a conclusion. So that enters into the equation, for example, if you're writing an opera. If you're somebody like Richard Strauss, who had a completely defective sense of timing, you may write stunning, marvelous things, but they just go on too long. And you get a feeling that they go on too long. Richard Strauss's father said to him, "Why don't you ever end something with a bang? Why is everything got to just dribble away quietly?" Strauss used to joke about that. But the truth is, his father had a point. Richard Strauss' tone poems, most of them, often begin with a stunning musical gesture. The locus classicus, of course, is Also sprach Zarathustra, the 2001 Space Odyssey music. And then it's all downhill from there. And just when you think it's going to be over, there's this long, endless sort of coda thing that happens. That happens in Ein Heldenleben, which really ought to end after the triumphant victory, after the battle. But no, there's 20 minutes more music after that. Even in his operas, Strauss always has a moment where, the plot's over, everything seems to be fine, and then everybody steps forward and sings for 20 more minutes. It happens in the trio in Der Rosenkavalier. It happens at the end of Die Frauen Schatten. It happens at the end of Ariadne auf Naxos. I mean, that's like his thing, and you can't cut those bits because they contain some of the most beautiful music the man ever wrote. It's absolutely gorgeous. But from a dramatic point of view, the dramatic form that Strauss is working in, it's a defect. And how much that defect matters, like I said, it depends on how great the music is at any given point and your own individual perception of what's happening, formally speaking, whether you're bored or not, whether you're ready to snooze off. Now, that is a much more serious issue when it comes to abstract forms where there aren't other distractions, such as visuals and stories and words and things you can follow and other things that help carry the music along. In an abstract piece like a symphony or a concerto or from any period, and it doesn't matter whether it's in sonata form or not in sonata form, the composer has to have a feeling of the overall shape of the piece, and when there has been enough repetition and variation to make the expressive point that the composer was shooting for, and to keep your interest sustained and to give you that feeling of satisfaction. That's like, oh, wow, that was just great. That, of course, is a terribly subjective quality as well, just how satisfied you're going to be. But there are certain signs that composers are uncomfortable with form. Take Edward Lalo, who we started with in his Symphonie Espagnole. By the time Lalo wrote his Symphonie Espagnole, by the second half of the 19th century, composers in the Romantic period were operating with a handling of form. And let's be clear, the actual term sonata form, the idea of sonata form, those things were not defined until later in the 19th century either. So nobody knew they were writing in sonata form. They just knew that they wanted to have a first theme and a contrasting second theme, and then some vague sort of developmental thing, and then they would repeat everything in the home key. It was something that you could observe and see that it was quite effective in the works of the great masters. So you would think, aha! I'm going to do that too. I'm going to take that form and stuff it into my own, melodic creations. And boy, it's going to be just terrific. Well, it depends on how well you understand what those composers did with the form and how well your musical material fits with what you intend to do in handling that form. Lalo's first movements, generally speaking, like the cello concerto and the Symphonie Espagnole and some other things, are often very formulaic. In other words, because the great composers didn't know that they were using a particular form, they used a particular style with a particular approach to the handling of musical elements, rhythm, tonality, dynamics, timbre, and all of those things. The later composers turned that into a formula. You're going to have a first theme. You're going to have a second theme. You got to have a sort of development-y type thing, and you're going to repeat them all. How mechanical does that become? How stiff does it sound? How natural does the music flow? In Lalo's case, basically you've got like first themes usually have like lots of sharp, loud chords. Jump, jump, does that for a little bit. And then you get something that's somewhat more lyrical. Sometimes the second subjects in the classical forms are more lyrical. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're more rhythmic. Well, in the Romantic period, they're almost invariably, you have a quickish first thing, and then a more songful second thing. And then there comes the development section. What do you do in that vast middle area before you get to repeat everything again, which is what you really want to do? Because one of the problems with the Romantic style is that it's based on gorgeous, long-breathed melodies. And that's what you want to hear, the gorgeous, long-breathed melody. You don't want to hear it developed, that is changed into something else, because it's not really capable of being changed into something else. The whole point of it is its gorgeous, long-breathedosity. That's what you want to hear. So, when composers start picking it apart, or if they do that, you just go, oh, what are they doing? It's not interesting at all. It doesn't bear being changed expressively into something that was originally maybe a little ambiguous and neutral into something that's actually very dynamic and thrilling. Because it's already dynamic and thrilling. You can only make it worse. That is often the case, with the handling of sonata forms in Romantic music. One of the locus classicus, for somebody who doesn't know how to develop locus classicus, a locus classici, loci, never mind. One of the great examples of somebody who can't develop a theme is Schumann. Schumann wrote fabulous music. He really, really did. But his development sections are totally non-developing because his ideas tend to be, as Tovey called them, epigrammatic. They are brief little gems that say what they say, and you can't make them say anything else. One of the most fabulous pieces of evidence of that is the development section of the first movement of the Rhenish Symphony. Now, you know that wonderful opening tune. Da 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 bum bum ba da 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 da. Oh, it's just gorgeous. So beautiful and songful, and it's bursts out of nowhere, and it just carries you along in a rush. Then you get to the development section. And the second theme too. Ya da 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 da, plaintive and songful. It's delicious. What else would you do with it? Well, Schumann has no idea. You get to the middle section of the Rhenish, and then he starts to try and do something, and he gets stuck. And he gets stuck a couple times. It goes do 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 da 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 dum da 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 dum da da dum ba bum ba bum ba. Then he's, oh, screw it, the hell with the first subject. Let's do the second one. Yeah, dude, it's just the same. It doesn't change at all. And then it comes around and he tries it again with the same result. And it sounds like you're going to be stuck there forever. Now, being a genius, Schumann makes something out of it. He uses this fabulous horn call to get us out of it. It's a coup de théâtre. It's a deus ex machina. The horns come roaring in with this with that fabulous horn call. Da bum ba da bum ba da 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 da. And with that, he gets to the recapitulation, and you can just feel his relief. Now, I understand people may listen to that and think it's just marvelous because Schumann does find a way out. He does. He manages to do it, but it's a close thing, and it's sort of making lemonade out of lemons. The form is not working the way it's supposed to work, and great composers usually manage to cover that up. I mean, if the rest of the work is wonderful and there are other fabulous aspects to it, well, sure, we forgive it. But in a piece of music which is less, a work of genius than Schumann's Rhenish Symphony, like Lalo's Symphony Espagnole, or dozens of other works we could name, the handling of form is far less either assured in its initial phases, or far less successful in getting out of a jam. And that's what I mean when I say a piece has formal issues or it's a bad handling of form. It's something that's very, very difficult to cover up in performance. It's something that may quickly become dull. It's something that may be irritating on repetition. It's something that does not sustain the constant repetition that we expect a great masterpiece will allow. That we can hear it over and over again, or hear it over and over and constantly find something different, something new, something fresh, something revelatory. It just sort of lays there. And that is bad form. I mean, that's the best way I could sum it up, using those few little examples. Just to Tovey said that his teacher, who was Parry, Sir Hubert Parry, who wrote terrible oratorios and some lovely orchestral works and other things, he said, offered this particular conundrum to composition students. What is the one thing we wish we could learn from the great masters, but we can't? And the answer is how to get out of a jam, because they never get into one. They're geniuses. And that's very true. In order to point to examples of bad form, you have to point to examples of not very good or second-rate music. And the great composers don't have that issue. We have to look at the ones who aren't so great. And so that's where you'll find bad form. And who wants to spend ages of time listening to third-rate composers mishandle their forms? It's not always fun. But it happens. And usually when we do talk about it, when I talk about it in the context of a piece where the form is something that the performers have to understand is problematic. And so they have to design their interpretation around minimizing whatever the faults are, which is part of a performer's job too, because nothing is ever perfect. And, the performer has to bring knowledge of what they're doing to the performance in order to present it to us, the listener, in the best possible light. And the smart performers can do it. They can make something which is absolute trash formally sound like a work of genius. Like, anything by Liszt, for example. Well, that's not true, because Liszt's forms are best when they're free, when they aren't following prescribed routes. That's what he tried to do in designing the symphonic poem, create a new type of form. And sometimes he was very successful at exploiting it, and sometimes he wasn't. Les Préludes is very successful. Ce qu'on entend sur la montagne, which I adore because it's so beautiful and atmospheric, is an absolute formal failure. Tovey described it as an introduction to a connecting link, to an introduction to a lyrical episode, which nobody's going to think is a beginning, to a recapitulation of all the introductions. I mean, that was his description of the form. So it depends on how much you want to pay attention to that aspect of it. That's all. That's form. I've had a form for this talk. I've spent quite a bit of time talking about form, and I've given this talk certain overarching structure. What it is, I have no idea, but hopefully it hasn't bored you to tears. If it didn't, its form was successful. It contained quite a bit of repetition and a certain amount of variation. Form is ubiquitous in music, and good forms and bad forms are solely a function of just how bored you become when you listen. That's the bottom line. QED. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.